news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. And I want to thank all of you who've reached out so far to help me cover the costs associated with hosting the upcoming Conference on Religious Trauma. If you're interested in helping, my PayPal link will be in our show notes. I'm excited for you to meet my guest today. Mahrs Schoppman is a queer and trans somatic psychotherapist with a private practice based out of his home office in Occidental, California, the traditional territory of the Graton, Rancheria, and coastal Miwok people. Mahrs specializes in working with the queer community and with those who live with the embodied traumatic impacts of growing up in an oppressive religious environment. I met Mahrs at one of Dr. Marlene Winnell's retreats, and he made me feel so welcome and safe that I immediately wanted to share him with all of you. That's my introduction. It's so nice to see you again, my friend.
It's so good to see you, Janice. I'm very grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
It was a real treat for us to connect at Dr. Winnell's retreat. She runs what she calls Release and Reclaim retreats through the Journey Free website. And she actually has an upcoming retreat that's going on. I'll have links for folks in the show notes. But when I heard even just the smallest bit of the story that you shared at the retreat, it was so compelling and so heart-wrenching and so inspiring. And I hope that today you would share some of that with our listeners and viewers.
I'm a somatic psychotherapist in California. I specialize in working with religious trauma within the queer community. The biggest reason I have such a passion for that is because it's so directly linked to my own pain and my own trauma recovery. As growing up a queer and trans person in a fundamentalist Christian environment in terms of a school setting and a church setting that I was very deeply involved in, so much so that I was a kind of like an assistant youth pastor and about to be step into a full-time youth ministry position before everything gratefully fell apart for me. We'll get to that. But something that's I think a little bit fairly unique about my story, or a piece about my story that I don't hear very often, is that I was the most religious person in my family. My folks found God in AA and NA. They were coming out of drug and alcohol addiction. They had their traumatic childhoods and pasts, and so they had kids, and they were kind of like, well, we found God through 12-step, and Christianity is Christianity. And so they sent my brother and I to a Christian school so that they could learn more about God through us and what we were learning there.
No pressure, though.
No pressure, right? Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. There was kind of a spiritual leader component, I feel, that was asked of me of a fairly young age that I took very, 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 very seriously. I took Christianity very seriously. I took the fundamental lies that were taught to me as truth. They lived in my body in an incredibly fearful way. An example I can provide is I remember I was probably in first grade, and at my school we had chapel at least once a week. And there was one day where the principal was unwrapping this butcher paper, and she pulled out this giant cow tongue, and she raised it in the air, and she said, "The tongue is the strongest muscle in the body." Right? And she was talking about how non-believers use swear words And that's how you can tell that they're non-believers, and that's how you can tell that they're going to hell, right? That if they were believers, the fruits of the Spirit would cleanse their tongue, and they wouldn't say swear words, right? Meanwhile, my dad was a carpenter, and cussed up a storm. my mom too, right? They were what I would say maybe a bit feral in their speech, right? My voicemail growing up said it was my dad's very gruff voice saying, "Leave a message or I'll kill you," right? So when my Christian principal school called, she thought she had the wrong number, but she didn't. And I would lay up awake at night, terrified of my parents going to hell. Like, absolutely terrified, and really believed that it was my responsibility to save them. And so for that example, I developed a cuss jar, and I would charge them every time they used a swear word. And they participated, but they didn't actually use it as a means to stop swearing. And so I would bring this giant jar of hundreds of dollars at the end of the year and give it to my school principal to give to a family in need around Christmas time.
Wow.
And say, this is our swear jar, right? To her dismay. And so that's just kind of an example of the pressure I felt as the spiritual leader. I think one of the things I still carry with me is that overdeveloped sense of responsibility for saving other people. It can look different ways, but that's something that I have to continue to track for myself. I grew up, there were Bible studies that happened in my living room quite regularly. And I found out later that they were ex-gay therapy Bible studies. My mom is a lesbian, and she was trying to heal, quote unquote, from that. The environment that I was in taught that homosexuality is the only unforgivable sin, taught that it's an abomination, that it's completely unnatural, that it goes against God's design for sexuality. And so she tried really hard to, quote unquote, heal. And when I was in high school, she ended up telling me, her and my dad split, and she ended up telling me about her sexuality. And I, because of everything that I was taught, really encouraged her to continue down this path. I felt a lot of fear for her. I felt a lot of shame of her. And I, it's not necessarily something I'm proud of, and I can have compassion for myself that I was a young person who was fed a dogma that blocked me from being able to love and accept my mom exactly as she is, in a way that I think is really natural for the body. Really natural for the body to just let that love flow out to people, to have compassion, to have empathy, to love people even when we don't understand them. And I think Christian dogma from other religions really thwarts that natural love. And yeah, so I mean that in itself is a big part of my story. And when I was in Christian college, I went to Azusa Pacific University in Southern California. I studied psychology and youth ministry. I was 6 months out from graduating and taking on a full-time youth ministry position when an organization called Soul Force, and within that, the Equality Ride, came to our school and did a presentation on the historical violence that has been been done in the name of the Bible, from the Crusades to colonization of various forms to slavery, and then to the treatment of LGBTQ plus folks. It was really powerful. It was really, really powerful. I was in the front row sobbing the entire time. And it was the first time I believed somebody say, God loves and affirms people of all sexual identities.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And despite my life of training, I believed it. Mm-hmm. Down to my bones. It in itself was like a baptism. Mm-hmm. I believed it through and through. I drove home that weekend. I told my mom the same thing. She believed me. And I saw the fruits of that is that I saw her come alive again. Wow. I saw all of what she had been repressing for years and years just kind of bloom, and a life force that I hadn't had the opportunity to really see before was so alive in her. And then it was only a few months after that I realized that I myself was queer. I don't really think that we, there's that thing where it can be hard for us to know what we can't really tolerate. I don't know that I would have survived that information. And until I was able to register it and process it, and I still freaked out. It was still terrifying. I had come to understand that it's okay for others, but the fact that it was now me meant that I couldn't work at the job that I had been training to work for. That I couldn't be a part of the church community that I loved so deeply. It put me in a faith crisis because I was able to see all of a sudden so many holes in theology and the crisis of empathy that exists within the evangelical church. And so it was a really big deal. And it was the hardest time of my life. It broke me, and that breaking led to a true freedom that I am so grateful for.
Wow, that's just, that whole story is amazing. I can't frankly believe that Soul Force was permitted to come and present at a Christian university. Do you know if they're even still around today, or if they're still offering that service? Because that sounds tremendous.
It's a great question. I think that Soul Force is still around. I wouldn't put money on it. I don't know. I don't think the Equality Ride is doing what they did anymore. I think they did it for 3 or 4 years. I'm pretty sure they visited just about every college and university that had it in their handbook that it's not okay to be gay or to practice being gay. Is what our handbook said. We were at the school I went to. You were allowed to be gay. You just weren't allowed to practice.
Wow.
So, but there's lots of jokes about practicing that.
Like it makes perfect. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Wow. And then that was liberating for you. And then you were able to share that with your mom, and she felt liberated and free to be herself.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is beautiful, and forever grateful for those people who were brave enough to come onto our campus. Because though we let them on, it was still the administration was incredibly hostile, nonetheless, and it was not true hospitality.
Not very Christian,
right?
So then you came to your own recognition that you also were queer, and it was then another whole circumstance to try and navigate through and figure out how you could love yourself. I don't know if that was an issue for you. Like, at what point did you, or even I'll just ask if you feel comfortable sharing, Where would you place yourself now on the spectrum of belief? Have you walked away from all of those Christian beliefs? Where are you now?
I have certainly walked away from all of those Christian beliefs. No part of me identifies with Christianity any longer. The story of Jesus is still an important story to me. In the radical message that I mean, I don't know what I believe about the Bible, but I just don't believe it's inerrant. But the myth of Jesus, the stories of Jesus are valuable to me, like many other myths are valuable to me. But I am pleased to say that I'm not a Christian and that I'm no longer afraid to say that.
Wow. Yes. Because that's another thing. It's one thing when we can kind of figure out, okay, I don't actually believe that anymore. But then there's such a fear behind blaspheming the Holy Spirit. And what if I'm wrong and all this other stuff? It can take a while for us to actually own it publicly and say out loud that we're not Christians anymore. How long was that portion of your journey from when you say you discovered your own queerness to completely exiting the religion?
It's a good question. It's certainly, and the truth is, I think that journey even started prior to me coming out as queer. There were various cracks in the, I don't even know what I would call it, you know. But from coming out and coming out to my church, I didn't make them fire me. I went and I resigned because I said, I know what your policies are. So I did a half, it was a half resign, half like I'm firing myself for you kind of thing. Lost that church, which was extraordinarily painful, still is. And then did try to do the like gay Christian thing for a while, was in like a gay Christian Bible study for a little bit, looked around for churches, but it just wasn't really fitting with me. And after college, me and 10 other friends decided to sort of reclaim what we thought church could be. And we found this big craftsman in downtown Los Angeles, and we moved in together, and we shared resources, and we ate meals together, and really had a big goal of serving the poor, of using our resources in a way that could create some harm reduction in the world. And those people were all also in the process of deconverting. And many of them were queer, many of them weren't, but we were all in a faith crisis together. And I can't tell you how grateful I am to have had really close community during that time. That togetherness was really big. My heart deeply goes out to people who do this alone. And I think that really helped me be like, you know what, I don't need to hold on to this old thing anymore. It doesn't fit. I don't believe it. And while I do believe there are Christians out there who aren't doing harm and who are working within Christianity to make the world a better place, my hat's off to them, and that's not my place. So I would say a few years until I was like really comfortable being like, that's not mine.
Wow. And so then you stepped out of the place where you were living communally with these other folks because it just wasn't your belief system anymore.
Well, no, we all were letting go of it together. Right. So it kind of started as a like, like Acts 2 church thing. And
Yeah.
then we're like, let's just love each other. Let's just do
Oh,
art. Let's just be
oh,
in our neighborhood.
how
And so
beautiful.
it kind of just turned into a big, wonderful artist community that still exists actually in
That's so cool.
Koreatown.
It's just fantastic. It's really wonderful that you had such close support when you were
Mhm.
deconstructing, because it can be such an isolating, alienating, sad, lonely time, difficult time for many people to be walking through and making that journey solo. So I'm really glad that you had support. And I wonder how it went when you told your folks, both when you came out to them as queer,
Mhm.
but also when you came out as a non-believer.
Mhm. 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 You know, my folks have always, I'm really, really lucky. They've been really supportive of me. And I've just been like, oh, okay, I guess we're not doing this anymore. And probably to some degree, they were probably relieved I was no longer a non-believer because
That you
I
were no
harassed
longer
them. I was like,
a
why aren't you going
believer.
to church? Why aren't we praying before meals? Like, here's another Bible. Here's another Bible. Gave my dad a John Elridge book. Like I was on them. So I'm imagining they were probably relieved when I was no
Mm.
longer like pushing my faith on them.
Yes.
Um, I don't know though. It's a good question. And they were both incredibly supportive when I came out as queer, which I did twice. Um, I came out first as a lesbian and then as a trans man.
Right. Yeah. And they were supportive. I'm so
Yeah.
glad that
Hmm.
it just
Hmm.
makes everything easier when we have support especially
Yeah.
in the difficult, challenging times of life. And
Yeah.
having that support from our parents really, really does make a difference. That's
It's
wonderful.
a it's a really huge deal, and it's not the dominant story, right? Of
Mhm.
queer folks coming out who come from religion. There's so much pain there, so much rejection that kids have to go through from their parents. That's just tragic. Yeah, and
Mhm.
it's just hard to imagine what. I mean, I think a lot, and I work a lot with people who have been disowned from their families, um, and it's just so tragic. And I also think about how Christians use the word unnatural so often to describe us and who we are and how we love. But I can't think of anything more unnatural than disowning your own child
Oh
based on who they are in the world,
yeah.
and
Very
in their
well put.
queerness. Mhm.
Yes, yes. Um, at my daughter's recommendation, my husband and I have been watching a series called Planet Sex with Cara
Mhm.
Delevingne, who's a British young woman. And it's been so eye-opening and so interesting. And one episode we watched recently was about the different things that go on in the brain and the body, kind of determining sex, sexuality, gender, exploring all those different things, what they mean, how our understanding of them
Mm.
has changed. And I thought it was magnificent. I wish that every church would see
Mm.
that so that they would stop using words like unnatural, because actually, guess what? Here's the shocker. You see it in nature all over the place.
Mm.
And if they are thinking, well, God doesn't make mistakes, I would like to know how they explain then some of these things that are
Yeah.
so different in
Mhm.
nature
Mhm.
and in humanity from what
Yeah.
they deem as perfect. And it's so
Mhm.
liberating to be able to be ourselves, to walk as ourselves through this world.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
tell us a little bit about the work that you are doing. I know you
Mhm.
are doing some group work
Mhm.
for queer folk right now. What does that look like?
It is such a joy to do that work. I started it probably about a year and a half ago now. I run therapy groups in California for queer identified folks who who have religious trauma, who were raised or exposed to some type of restrictive religion. And the reason I started doing it is because I was working with individuals with religious trauma a lot, and you can do a lot of work individually, but I just kind of kept feeling that there was something that the individual work wasn't getting to. And I realized one day that religious trauma is a group trauma, and so it needs group spaces to heal. Just like trauma is relational and it needs relationship to heal. It occurred to me that there needs to be group energy for this. And so I started conducting a year's worth of group interviews, put a call out to folks with religious trauma, and did a number of group interviews to learn more about it. There's so much wonderful. There's quite a bit of wonderful information out there on religious trauma, and it's a growing field. There's still not that much, and there's not much that I've come across specifically for queer folks. And so I did some of my own anecdotal research, which was really wonderful and enlivening and enlightening. And shortly after that, I felt ready to start running some groups. And I've done, I think, 5 now. I'm about to start another one on May 10th. They're 10 weeks. And they're part psychoeducational about religious trauma, part really focused on the body and how religion colonizes the body to turn against itself.
Please talk some more about that. That's so important. And that's such an interesting concept.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the impacts of trauma in general can be shame, right? Can be self-hatred, can be dissociation, right? And restrictive religion experiences tell children at a really young age, you are bad. Your body can't be trusted, right? If you just let your body drive the ship, then where's it going to drive? Straight to hell, right? You need to find truth outside of you, right? In my life, it was the white guy on the stage, right? It was this ancient text that has had so many different translations, and we're so far from the original context in which it was written, right? It's this notion of the Holy Spirit will tell you, right? But everything true has to come from the outside, and so I see it as a training of dissociation as holiness, right? And talk about unnatural again, right? Like, what's more natural than our bodies?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And the wisdom of our bodies, right? And so these lies, I think the energy of religion wants to colonize, of restrictive religion. The energy of restrictive religion wants to colonize. It colonizes nations, cultures, on large scales, but on smaller scales, on a fractal energy, it colonizes our bodies, right? And it tells us that we can't trust ourselves. It tells us lies about hell, really scary lies, right? It tells us that God is always watching, that God is always judging. Don't do the wrong thing, right? That fear. And so I lost my train of thought.
That's all right. That's all right. It was very interesting hearing you talk about colonization, because it really is something that I feel, white, capital W, white people are really just starting to tune into and start understanding and going, oh, yes, okay, we definitely bear a responsibility here and need to be learning about what has been done. And including, those of us who were colonized by religion, even who are white, and just learning how it's kind of infiltrated our bodies. So you work with people to liberate themselves from those, doing somatic techniques?
Yeah, doing a lot of just like present moment. This is your body. What are you noticing in your body? Can you bring compassion to those sensations? Can you let yourself finish? Every emotion has a beginning, middle, and end, right? So working on techniques of really finishing emotions, of really accepting all emotions, especially ones that were banned, like anger, right? And just really, really working on like how do you know what you know now based on the cues that your body is giving you, right? Down to like what kind of food do you actually like, to how do you like to be touched? How do you know when you have a no versus a yes? Because you can't have a true yes without the ability to say no.
So
right?
You talk about consent as well, because that's a foreign concept for so many of us who grew up religious.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We talk about consent and boundaries a lot. We talk about the wisdom of anger pointing to our boundaries and practicing having boundaries and really exploring what we were taught about boundaries. But yeah, absolutely. Consent is a huge part of healing from purity culture and fundamentalism. Like you get to choose what happens to you.
Yes. And recovering from purity culture, in particular, purity culture indoctrination, that is such a massive hurdle for so many people. It's one thing to lose your faith or leave your faith, and then you have to cope with all of that and determine your secular identity now that you're no longer a believer. Start finding and building communities outside of religious groups. But that sexual piece really is a tricky piece of the puzzle for so many folks who some of us grew to hate our bodies and feel unsafe with any sensations at all. And so we have not had, we haven't had practice being sexual, and certainly, let alone enjoying being sexual with ourselves or with other people. And it can feel scary for folks even to think about it, because that was such a big sin that you weren't supposed to do that. So that's a piece of the puzzle. And then I think for those of us on the LGBTQ spectrum, then it's also about we're learning to accept ourselves and the fact that, okay, you know what, I am attracted to these sorts of people, and this does feel good for me. So what does that mean? How do I move forward? Like people who don't even have experiences with dating, because dating wasn't allowed. You just like courted and got married, and that was it. And now lots of folks come to me in midlife. They married young as Christians, and they don't know what to do. They're not happy in their marriage. They're not happy in their sexual relationship with each other, but they don't know how to proceed from there. Does that ever come up in your groups, people wondering about how do they start dating or anything like that?
I think maybe a little bit here and there. My groups, so at least so far, have been folks who left the religion a while ago and are still struggling with the fact that they're still impacted by it. And we're like, I don't believe in hell anymore. Why am I lying awake at night terrified of hell? Right? Like, I love being queer. I'm so happy I'm queer. I'm so grateful for being queer. Why do I still feel ashamed about being queer at the same time? So that hasn't come up like so much in my groups, but certainly it has. And I think that specifically for queer folks, there's this question of, well, how do I enter queer community, right? Like, I was taught my whole life that this is bad, right? And so like just like jumping into the club scene isn't really like going to be a comfort zone, right? yeah, there are like, how do I do this? How do I build queer community? How do I get involved in this? And it can feel a lot like stepping out of a cave, right? And be like, who's Beyonce, right? Like what? Like
Mhm.
um,
We have such cultural gaps and social gaps and just
mhm,
relationship gaps that we're trying to
mhm.
catch up on and figure out.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And navigating the material world, right, is so tricky for those of us who lived in those caves for so long.
Oh yeah. I mean, I speaking for
Mhm.
myself, I went from absolutely denying myself everything to denying myself nothing. So there was an awful lot of experimenting and just, kind of craziness that ensued as I really went through just almost a secondary adolescence and
Yeah.
participating in things that had been off limits, anything that had been off limits before I was giving myself permission, with
Hmm.
consenting adults.
Right.
But it was so shocking. I'm sure my children got whiplash from that, having that front row seat to that gong show
Sure.
as mom
Whoa.
lost her mind and threw everything off, cast aside everything to really dive into life. And I spent,
Hmm.
a few years there. And now I've kind of come back more towards the middle,
Hmm.
standing solidly, firmly on the ground, feeling safe, feeling good
Hmm.
about who I am and the direction my life is going in. But
Hmm.
it took a while because it was a lot to climb out from underneath.
Oof. I mean, it really is a rebirth, right? Talk about being born again, right? It's like coming out into this world again. I go, oh, there's so much here. I can
Mhm.
just do all of this.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. You're kidding me. I can do this thing. I tell my
Mhm.
clients that it's like life is a giant buffet table, and
Mm,
fundamentalism would have us starve to death. Right at that
mm,
buffet table, fundamentalism says you get this one tiny boring dish for the rest of your life. Everything else is off limits. And that's a terrible
mm,
way to live. We don't need to starve to death. We need to learn about consent, uh, and also learn about what we like, what feels
mm.
good for us, what it's like for us to make choices.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And to seek pleasure, right? We talk about pleasure a lot in groups, and to get really curious about what feels really good to you,
Mhm.
right? Like sexually, yes, but also just like out in the world, like what what turns you on, what lights you up, right? Like turn your favorite foods to favorite colors to favorite textures to activities. Like that's such pleasure is such a good entry point into the body when you've been taught your whole life to not embody yourself.
Beautiful. Yes. And it sounds like thinking back to the communal type living situation you were in that then really evolved into more of an artist community. Did
Mhm.
art play a role for you in your deconstruction?
Absolutely, it played a huge role for me in my deconstruction in terms of helping me process what was happening. I would say specifically poetry was a way of really like finding my voice. Right, as
Mhm.
somebody who was taught to not speak a lot, like sit down and to be quiet, right, to really find my voice, and surrounded by other poets and painters and musicians, and we started just doing regular like monthly open mics, called salons, and just having um, felt in like ways like what church should be, of just really coming together and really communing and sharing our hearts with one another. um Art has been huge in terms of pleasure and vitality and awakening, purpose.
Wow. So I think I heard you say that you are working on a book, and I wonder
Mhm.
if any of your poetry will factor into your book.
That's a great question. I write poetry in a very strange way. Where I don't write them down. I write poems in my head, and doing so, they become memorized. And there's just this thing. I've tried to write them down a few times, and they don't want to be written down.
Interesting.
And as I'm writing this book, I'm working on flexing more of my prose writing, right? But it does weave in kind of how I've always known to write, which is more poetic. This is no textbook. Um, it's more of a memoir storytelling while weaving in knowledge about religious trauma and the embodied impacts that it has on folks.
Wow. Oh, I just love that. And I know for myself, poetry and this is so when I was leaving religion, but also when different relationships ended and I was trying to process what went on, poetry felt like such a safe way for me to say some things and get my feelings out, whether it was anger or just tremendous sorrow, whatever it was. And I felt like it gave me a little bit of space emotionally to express those things. And maybe it's the same for folks who do painting or dancing or whatever form of art they choose to work with.
Oh, I love knowing that you're a poet.
Yes. Yep. I like it. I like
I'm not
writing
surprised
poems.
at all.
Oh, really? Yeah, I find it helpful and definitely encourage other folks to explore it because one size doesn't fit all in life. But yeah, particularly when we're talking about recovery from trauma. And I really like it that your work focuses so much on the body. On potentially what's been stored in there and how to release it and to enjoy other things, learning about pleasure that you were talking about. That's just so fascinating. So did you have to take specific courses in your training then to become a somatic psychotherapist?
Yeah, my master's degree is in somatic psychology. I went to a school in San Francisco, California Institute of Integral Studies, and they have a somatics program there. And as soon as I saw that possibility, I just felt like earthquake in my body of like, that's what I want to do. I want to work with the body. And yeah, it's a beautiful field. It's a growing field. There's so many different ways of of working with the body, and working somatically. But it's really, I find it to be really enriching, right? Because no matter where you go in the world, you're the only one that's definitely going to go there with you, right? And so befriending the body, having compassion for the bodily experience, I think can alleviate so much suffering.
That is such a tremendous also act of resistance, deciding that we are going to love and have compassion for and befriend our bodies when everywhere we're, receiving messages from social media and commercials and movies and everything else that you're only lovable if you're this, if you fit in this very narrow idea, then you're desirable. Otherwise, and I mean, here's where the advertisers make all their money. Otherwise, you need to lose weight and do this and do that, and they're going to sell you whatever they think you need to change things about your body. It's really sad.
It's so sad. There's so much emphasis on the body from the outside perspective, right? Like an obsessive emphasis. Like you're saying, you're only lovable if you look this certain way, right? This dominant capitalistic narrative of like white and thin and able-bodied and beautiful in a really narrow and particular way, right? And with so little emphasis of what does it feel like to be in your body, right? Do you feel alive? Do you feel connection, right? Do you have a sense of positive connection with the fact that you are a body, right? Not just a soul like you were taught when you were growing up, right? But that life is here and it's happening in your body and you have access to all of the wonderful sensations, which also means access to all the painful sensations. But there's a marriage there between pain and pleasure and grief and gratitude, and you can't turn off one without turning off both. Um, so yeah, I totally agree with you.
Find it really interesting also to learn about how different cultures view sex and sexuality and things that maybe are common or uncommon in their cultures. I know Amanpour and Company did a wonderful show. I think it was called Sex and Love Around the World, and it was a series just peeking into every different culture you can imagine, and what it's like to be a sexual being in those cultures. And it was so eye-opening and interesting, because I feel like we can have such a prudish attitude towards it here in North America. And I think particularly the United States can struggle with that attitude. And it's, of course, all the Christian training and the purity culture indoctrination there. So I love the idea of people's minds being expanded by exploring sex in other cultures and what that looks like. Very cool.
Absolutely. I'll have to check that out. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really good one. So is there anything in particular that you think would be helpful for therapists to recognize, an area where you see there's room for improvement in the therapy world, either related to religious trauma recovery or being part of the queer community and, trauma that goes along with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something really important for therapists who work with religious trauma to understand that the queer community is hit in a really different way around religious trauma. We embody things that dominant patriarchal religion are deeply threatened by. And they're right, we are a threat to their existence, right? Like our energy does rupture dominant patriarchal religion. It points to holes in the theology. It exposes the crisis of empathy. Churches are breaking up constantly because they can't agree on what to do with us. I've known a lot of straight folks who have left the church because they didn't like how they saw queer folks being treated, right? So there is like a very true reality that we're a threat. And in that, they come after us. They come after us hard, and it has devastating impacts. We can look around at what's happening in legislation across the United States right now. That some states are trying to ban the ability to say gay. Right, the banning of drag, the criminalization of transition, the criminalization of parents supporting their young ones transitioning, the attack is still happening, right? Even when we leave the church, we can't escape the context of religious trauma in the way that it infiltrates everything. And I think that is true for everybody, right? And yet there's a heavy-handedness, an extra heavy-handedness, I think, that comes for queer folks, who are given a lot less choice. And I think that choice is the opposite of trauma. And so I think just an understanding of that. And I'm so grateful for all of the religious trauma spaces that exist now, that I don't think existed, nearly to this capacity 10, even 5 years ago. Right? Yeah. And I still think there's a lot of work that we have to do to support the queer community, and to celebrate the ways that queerness dismantles religion and to support the queer communities in the ways that we hold this burden on our backs of them really coming after us hard.
I never thought of it that way before, but absolutely. Owning your queerness is poking patriarchy, religious patriarchy in the eye. It really is just, and that is something I can absolutely get behind. That's marvelous. And I definitely want to support however I can. And part of that is having guests like yourself come on to the podcast, and then also the conference on religious trauma. And that's happening in October. And I'm very glad that you're going to be a part of that as well. Looking forward to it. And so we'll, of course, in the show notes, we'll have links for that because tickets are on sale now. And I did want to also let folks know. So last year I did an event called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. It was another online conference. And I'm offering all the sessions for those right now for just $50 American, because I feel like the content was so powerful, so profound and wonderful, and engaging and exciting that I think it's that important. I want everybody who needs it, or is even just curious about it, to have access to those recordings from Shameless Sexuality. And in fact, if someone is really struggling financially, they can just reach out to me personally, and I will make sure that it's affordable enough for them to be able to have access to those recordings, because we want to keep expanding people's knowledge of religious trauma syndrome, and the growth and help that's available.
Gotta spread the good news, right, Janice?
Yay! That's right. This is the really good news. That's the truth. Well, anything else that you wanted to share or say before we sign off? How can folks reach you? How can they find you?
I can be found on my website, www.therapywithmahrs.com, MAHRS. It will be updated soon to include more of my religious trauma offerings. It isn't very updated now, but that website, my email address, I can be emailed through there. But my email address is just Mahrs, MAHRS, Schoppman, SCHOPPMAN @gmail.com. I'm happy for anybody to reach out.
Awesome. That's terrific. I'll make sure that information gets into the show notes. And I just want to thank you. I wish I could give you a big hug right now, as long as you consent to it.
Of course, of course.
Thanks so much, Mahrs. This has
so
really
good
been a
to see
pleasure.
you. Wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me, Janice.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you for tuning in today. It was just such a pleasure doing this show. Take care, everyone.